our son. When our youngest son was 3 years old, he shared something that left us completely awestruck. It happened one morning in 2006, while we were sitting at the kitchen table eating pancakes. The kids were chatting about plans for the day, swimming and other fun things, when out of nowhere, our son smiled brightly and said, "I get to be a kid again." My husband and I exchanged puzzled looks, and I asked, "Were you a kid before?" Without hesitation, and with the calm confidence of an adult recounting a memory, he said, "Before, I was a man. I was a big man, tall and strong, like Daddy, but even stronger. I had black hair, I had many sons, but one of my sons died in an accident. I loved him so much. I gently carried my dead son to a place where I dug his grave. After I buried him, I stood there and cried and cried. But then I remembered I still had other sons I loved. So I said goodbye and went home to my family." He paused to take a bite of his pancake, then added with a big smile, "But now I'm a kid again." The joy in his voice was undeniable. My husband and I sat in stunned silence for a moment before asking more questions. My husband asked, "Do you remember your name or your son's name?" Without missing a beat, our son replied, "My name was Massimo." When I asked what he did for work, he said, "I had lots of land, and I took care of everything. I did lots of jobs." But just as quickly as the memory surfaced, he lost interest in talking about it, climbed down from his chair, hugged us both, and ran off to play, full of joy and energy. He brought up his life as Massimo 2 more times over the years, though always briefly. Once, when he mentioned seeing a dead person, I asked where, and he gave me an incredulous look and said, "When my son died." Another time, he simply mentioned that he couldn't wait to grow up and be a big, strong man again. But no matter how we tried to prompt him, he always brushed it off, as if those memories had lost their importance. Now, he's 16, and when we bring it up, he just chuckles and says he doesn't remember. He still has a loving, joyful spirit and a deep appreciation for family and life. While he may not recall being Massimo, I can't help but hope that this life as our son is his best one yet. My daughter showed me her old parents' grave. Last year, shortly after my daughter turned 4, we had an experience that still amazes me. My son had been curious about cemeteries, so my mom and I decided to take the kids to visit her parents' graves. While we were there, my daughter wandered off to a nearby row of graves. I followed her and found her standing in front of a headstone for a couple, quietly staring. "These were my old parents," she said matter-of-factly. I paused, confused, and asked what she meant. She looked at me and explained, "They were my parents before, but they died." Then, as if continuing a routine stroll, she walked several graves down the row and stopped at another headstone on the opposite side. "This was my old sister," she declared. "I like living with you guys better because she was so mean to me. We used to fight all the time." I was stunned. The last name on the sister's grave matched the couple she just identified as her old parents. Out of curiosity, I later looked up the names. Sure enough, the couple on the first grave were the parents of the woman buried in the second. What struck me was that none of the surrounding graves seemed to belong to the same family. It didn't appear to be a designated family section of the cemetery. It just seemed that the daughter happened to be buried near her parents. My daughter, however, was entirely nonchalant about the whole thing. She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I didn't press her further. If it was real, it felt too strange to probe. And if it was a coincidence, I didn't want to read too much into it. Still, it's a story I thought you'd appreciate. I've never given much thought to past lives, but your question brought back a memory from junior high. One morning, I came downstairs and told my mom, I had the weirdest dream. I dreamed I had a baby, and we kept it in a shoebox in the oven. I thought it was just a strange, nonsensical dream. But my mom responded, "That's what they did with your great aunt." She explained that my great aunt, born prematurely around 1905 in the rural southern US, had been kept in a shoebox inside a gas oven, not turned on, just warmed by the pilot light, to keep her alive, an improvised incubator. She lived into her 50s before passing away from cancer, years before I was born. Throughout my life, I felt a persistent connection to her. Whenever my grandparents encouraged me to choose family heirlooms I'd like to keep, I'd often point to something and say, "I like this," only to be told, "Oh, that was your great aunt's. I've ended up with many of her belongings, and they mean more to me than anything else from my family." The strangest incident happened years later. While visiting my mom's hometown, we stopped by her cousin's house where an older family acquaintance, someone in her 80s whom I'd never met, was visiting. As I walked into the living room, I was struck by an immediate and intense dislike for her. She seemed perfectly sweet and polite, but I had this overwhelming sense, as if she were a cat with a bird in her mouth, like she had a secret or had done something wrong and gotten away with it. The feeling was so strong and unshakable, even though she gave no outward reason for it. Later, I mentioned this to my mom, admitting, "I don't know why, but I really didn't like her." My mom replied, "Well, she's the woman who had an affair with your great-aunt's husband while your aunt was very ill. I think your great-aunt died of a broken heart because of it." I was murdered as a child, and records exist. When I was about 3 years old, I often spoke to my parents about my past life. Intrigued, they wrote down the details I shared, even though it seemed like a child's vivid imagination. A year ago, I decided to revisit this part of my life through a self-guided regression session. Here's what I remembered from my early childhood recollections. My name or nickname was B. I died when I was 9 years old. I was left alone, and someone took me. I had a brother named Gabe. Using this information, I meditated to try and retrieve more memories. I didn't follow a specific regression guide or video. I just let myself focus on what came naturally. My visuals were hazy. I'm not very strong with mental imagery, but I had distinct sensations. I felt cold. There was a sweetness in my mouth, like candy. I could hear the sound of running water. My vision was blurred, almost like it was censored. With these fragmented details, I began searching for similar stories online. What I found left me stunned. The case of Mary B. Perez. Her story aligned with my memories. The name, her age, the tragic circumstances of her death. It was chilling, yet fascinating. While my current life is vastly different, living in another country with a new family and dynamic, there are subtle psychological echoes that connect the two. As a child, I was overwhelmed with a paralyzing fear of being separated from my parents. Even short overnight school trips made me physically ill. I avoided sleepovers entirely until I was in high school. But as I grew older, I transformed into someone fiercely independent. At 18, I moved to a different city, living completely on my own and thriving. It felt as though I had worked through a deep, lingering fear, perhaps tied to that past experience. Talking about this feels strange, almost inappropriate, like I'm exploiting a tragedy that isn't fully mine. Her family still mourns her loss, and she is remembered and cherished in her community. It's both beautiful and heartbreaking. But I wanted to share my story because I don't know anyone who believes in reincarnation, let alone in something as personal as this. I also recognize how unique it is to live in a time when information about a possible past life is just a few clicks away. One day, I hope to visit San Antonio out of curiosity and respect for the life I believe I once lived. For now, I hold on to this connection, grateful for the perspective it has given me and the healing it has allowed me to experience. My 4-year-old is saying some past lifey stuff. My 4-year-old daughter has recently been saying things that feel unusual, to say the least. We live a pretty normal life in East Asia, and she's growing up in an environment where metaphysics or ideas of past lives aren't really discussed. But some of the things she's been saying have been hard for me to dismiss. It started innocently enough with her fascination with cars. She began asking lots of questions about driving, why she couldn't drive a car, how people learn to drive, and the whole process of driving tests. After I explained why children can't drive, she seemed satisfied, but maintained a persistent desire to drive herself someday. Then, she started asking about death. A lot. She'd ask me what happens when people or animals die, where they go, and if she could meet people who have already died, like her great-grandmother. Her questions about death were oddly mature, and she seemed to grasp its permanence. One day, she said something that gave me goosebumps. I was an old lady, and then I died. That alone was enough to shake me a bit, but then things got even stranger. My daughter started talking about her grandparents, except they weren't the grandparents she has in this life. She described a grandfather who built a house and then built another one attached to the first. She said she lived with this grandfather and grandmother. When I asked for her grandmother's name, she replied with what sounded like the name of a minor U.S. state, though she clarified it wasn't actually her name. When I asked about her grandfather, she gave me an unusual male name. I decided to look it up, not expecting much, but to my surprise, there's a small town in that state with the exact name she mentioned. The thing is, my daughter barely speaks English and has never been exposed to information about this relatively obscure state. It's not part of her media, toys, or books. Then there was the bird. She kept talking about a big, colorful bird she once had that would sit on her shoulder or forearm. I showed her pictures of various parrots, but she rejected them all, until we came across an image of a rainbow lorikeet. As soon as she saw it, her eyes lit up, and she said, "That one." What struck me was that there were other colorful birds in the mix, but she didn't react to any of them. Only the lorikeet. She often concludes her stories with a simple, matter-of-fact statement. I was old and I died. One day, I decided to ask her more about cars, particularly what she did with them. She answered casually, "Well, people get hurt, so we pick them up in the ambulance when they ask for help." Later, while looking at pictures of buildings in the state she'd mentioned, I showed her an image of a small regional hospital. It didn't have any obvious signs or ambulances in the photo, but she pointed to it and said, "You drop the injured or sick people there." What unsettles me is how mundane her story is. She doesn't claim to have been someone extraordinary like a queen or a famous historical figure. Instead, she describes the life of a rural woman in 20th century America, a place she's never known, who worked for an ambulance service, had a rainbow lorikeet as a pet, and lived to an old age before passing away. As a skeptic and atheist, I struggle to wrap my head around this. I don't believe in reincarnation, and I generally view such stories with deep skepticism. But hearing her speak about these things with such conviction and detail has shaken me. At the very least, her stories make me wonder. Sharing my daughter's past life details. My daughter, now nearly 5, has been talking about what seem like memories from a past life since she was about 18 months old. Though these moments have become less frequent as she's gotten older, they're still vivid and significant when they come up. The first moment that really struck me happened when she was 18 months old. I had Pandora playing on my TV, with the album covers displayed. While I was cleaning and she was playing, the song Lean On Me came on. It had been years since I'd heard it, and I couldn't have even told you the artist. Suddenly, my daughter dropped what she was doing, ran up to the TV, and shouted, "Bill Withers." At first, it didn't seem too strange, until I realized my daughter, who couldn't yet read and had never heard that song before, somehow knew who Bill Withers was. She stared at the screen with tears in her eyes, like she was having a deeply emotional moment. She stood still, transfixed, for the entire song. It felt like I was witnessing her very first flashback. When she was about 2.5, she began talking about someone named Hanky. At first, I thought he was just an imaginary friend. But one day, during a bath, she told me, "You know Hanky is real, right?" My mind jumped to the idea of a ghost, but she explained further, very calmly. "I was a mommy before I came here to you. I had a baby Hanky who was too sick to come home from the hospital. I only got to hold him for a while. I asked her what Hanky looked like, and she replied in a tone that suggested I should already know. Like a sleeping baby who never wakes up. Duh. At that point, I was in tears. I asked if she remembered what her name was before she became her current name, but she said she didn't know. She did, however, say she had lived in Rockford, a city not too far from where we are now. I've tried to research her story based on the details she's given me, but I haven't been able to find anything definitive. Her preferences and knowledge have also been fascinating. She's always had a strong attraction to African American artists, reggae, and jazz. Her favorite musicians include Bob Marley, Inner Circle, Bill Withers, and Louis Armstrong. She's recognized many musicians by their faces without any prior introduction. One of the most striking moments happened last year when we were standing in line at the grocery store. There was a magazine featuring the movie Bohemian Rhapsody with Freddie Mercury on the cover. My daughter immediately gravitated toward it and said, "Freddie Mercury. I remember going to that show. He played in a band. There were so many people there." She flipped through the pages, looking at each picture with intense focus and emotion. She said, "I can't believe I remember that. This has become so normal for us that I've just learned to accept it." But it startled the man standing behind us in line. He couldn't help but comment, and we ended up talking about her mini regressions and past life moments. She just seems to know things no child her age would typically know, especially about music and culture from the 60s to the 80s. She has an aura about her, like she's carrying knowledge beyond her years. Even my boss at a counseling and recovery center, someone who's seen a lot in his career, was fascinated by her and couldn't quite explain it. These are just some of the moments that stand out, but there are many more. She's an incredible old soul with wisdom and insights far beyond her age, and I feel lucky to be her mom. Horses. This is going to sound strange at first, but it will make more sense as the story unfolds. For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with horses. But it wasn't in the usual way that many kids dream of having a pony. It was something different, something deeper. I loved horses with an intensity that went beyond them being my favorite animal. Everything I owned revolved around horses. Bedding, clothing, and even my bedroom decor once I was old enough to choose them myself. But what really stood out was how much I knew about them, far beyond what would make sense for someone my age. Before I could even read, I was already talking about Andalusians. I told my parents they were my favorite type of horse, even though I had no way of knowing what a breed or pedigree was at the time. My parents remember me consistently asking for an Andalusian for my birthday or Christmas, despite the fact that we lived in a bustling city far removed from farms or barns. They couldn't understand how I even knew about such a specific Spanish breed. When they asked me why I wanted that breed in particular, I explained that I used to own one. This answer confused them, but whenever they pressed me, I'd correct them and say things like, "No, this was before." There were other strange moments too. When I played with my toy horses, I'd sometimes stop, sigh, and say, "I miss riding my horse, Jules." My parents would remind me that I'd never owned a real horse, let alone ridden one, but I'd always respond, "Not now. This was before, when I was a grown-up, like you." They chalked it up to a wild imagination. Things got even stranger during a road trip through western Kansas. As we drove past open fields and rustic barns, I felt an overwhelming sense of homesickness. It was as if I recognized the place, even though I'd never been there. At one point, I spotted a ranch with horses grazing in the sun and excitedly leaned forward between the front seats, telling my parents, "I used to have a house like that and a big barn full of horses." I loved reading stories to them and brushing their manes. When my parents gently reminded me that we'd never lived anywhere other than our current home and never owned horses, I felt frustrated trying to explain. All I could say was, "No, before, when I was a grown-up. I had my own house and a barn full of horses. But then my house was on fire, and I couldn't get out because the door was too hot. So I just died there." I remember the vivid dreams I had as a child. Dreams where I could feel the heat of flames and the terror of being trapped. My parents were understandably unsettled, because they had never exposed me to stories about fires at that age. The most bizarre experience happened when we went to a county fair. They had a horse riding attraction, and it was the first time I'd ever touched a real horse in this life. But the moment I saw them, it felt completely natural to me. I ran up to the horses, petting and examining them as if I'd done it 1,000 times before. I even identified specific breeds, which surprised the handler. He asked if we owned horses, and my parents had to admit that we didn't. When it came time to ride, I instinctively jumped up and swung my leg over the saddle with ease, as though I'd done it every day of my life. Holding the reins and feeling the horse move beneath me felt like picking up where I'd left off in another time, another life. As the ride ended, I found myself in tears. Later that day, my parents sat me down and asked me to explain everything I remembered. I described my home, my horses, and the people I could recall. They seemed bewildered, but also wanted to believe me. A week later, they surprised me with riding lessons. While I already felt like I knew how to ride, I eagerly accepted. It was the closest I could get to reliving my connection to horses in our city life. These memories never faded as I grew older. Unlike many children who forget their past life recollections, mine stayed with me and even shaped my life. I went to university to study veterinary medicine, specializing in horses, and eventually moved to the countryside. I now own an Andalusian mare, and every time I brush her mane, I feel that same deep connection I've always had with horses. Even with my logical and scientific background, I've always wondered about the mystical thread that ties me to these animals. I've looked into past lives and reincarnation, and I'm certain that's what I'm experiencing. I still dream of uncovering who I used to be, hoping for closure and to tell myself, you're okay. You've been given a second chance. But with no clear location, date, or other details, tracking down a specific house fire feels impossible. For now, I live this life, caring for horses and cherishing the inexplicable bond I feel with them. The strange memories and innate knowledge of a life I never lived still linger, but deep down, I know that I did.